The headlines are salacious and sometimes even vicious. Young voters are fed up with their older leaders, says one recent headline, and this is one of the mild ones. While voters across the spectrum express rising doubts about the country's political leadership, few groups are as united in their discontent with the political process as young voters. What are young people so upset about? And will their hurt feelings cause them to sit out the midterms and the upcoming 2024 presidential election? And are older elected officials really out of touch with millennials and Gen Z voters? Young voters and experts weigh in, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
A recent New York Times poll found that only 1% of 18 to 29-year-olds strongly approve of the way Joe Biden is handling his job as president. 94% of Democrats under the age of 30 said they want another candidate to run for president in 2 years. Now, young voters were also more likely to say they wouldn't vote for either Biden or Trump in a hypothetical 2024 matchup. Many young voters feel disengaged and deflated, with only 32% saying they will vote in the November midterms. Now, a Harvard poll says that 36% of young voters will be voting this November, and that's about the same percentage as we saw voting in the 2018 midterms. So according to the Harvard poll, there's not much to be alarmed about. But when you compare that number to the 2020 presidential election, where 55% of young voters went to the polls, it is a shocking number. Now, young voters say that older voters talk about upholding institutions and restoring norms when they want to see their leaders talk about more sweeping changes like a third party, maybe even a third party candidate. And they want to see more viable young elected officials that they think will have more in common with them and have a greater perspective about the issues that are driving them. Sadly, nearly half of all the young voters in this poll said that they didn't think their vote mattered at all. Whew, that's a lot to take in. So based on these polls, it looks like only 32 to 36% of young voters will be going to the polls in November. So today I'm asking my young voters, a millennial and a Gen Zer, what's happening with the 64% of other voters or potential voters, young voters who are not going to the polls? Why are they sitting elections out? My first guest is Daniel Rosebud. He's an organizer with Opportunity Youth United. And this is a grassroots organization that has its finger on the pulse of young voters and is working across the country to organize voters. Good morning and welcome back to the show, Rosebud.
Good morning. Good morning. I appreciate you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, these numbers are a little shocking. Well, let me put it in perspective. According to the polls, the same percentage of voters, young voters that voted in 2018 are predicted to vote in these 2020 midterms. So that number is about the same, but that number is considerably lower than the percentage of voters that voted in the presidential election. And then there's all this talk about young voters saying, look, Biden is not doing the job. Only, I think, 1% of young voters thought that he should, remain in that position or should be considering running again in 2024. So what's happening? Tell me what young voters are thinking.
I would say that it's a mix of things. Along with that historic, presidential election, we here in the Southeast in Georgia, we had another local historic election with Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. And so the energy from that presidential election really carried over for us, where we understood the importance of really turning out for those following elections. What's going on now is that there are more local historic elections going on, right? So those elections that follow the presidential election. There is still a lot of misinformation, and young people may not know how to navigate a political landscape right now. And so our job becomes not necessarily fantasizing another presidential election right now, because people would like us to be very focused on that right now, right? Biden has a lot to clean up. I'm sure that he may be making some mistakes, but right now we have to give him his space. I think that mostly we have to focus on these local elections. We have 10 states going through very historic gubernatorial elections, including Georgia. And we're also running the gambit with people like Herschel Walker, who is spreading misinformation about very important issues to young people like climate justice. We're losing more and more faith in a system that was supposed to be designed for us. A lack of federal protection when it comes to women's rights, a lack of federal protection when it comes to gun violence in schools against our youngest in our elementaries. You know, as we see gun violence break out, we still see that there's even more at elementary schools, right? How do we not preempt ourselves and protect our younger ones? And so I think a number of things that are happening. My niece is turning 18 in August the 10th, right? And so she will be a young voter, that first time voter that gets to vote in a very historic election, like when I turned 18 for Obama. How do I educate her and make sure that she understands her, how we should be advocating for her and her rights and her protections as a young person, as a woman, and as somebody that's about to enter the working world, right? So I think that there's a lot of misinformation, and young people just really need guidance through the process. This is different from a presidential election.
No, really great points. I want to ask you a couple of questions because you said a lot, and I want to unpack some of it, Rosebud. First, where are young voters getting their information from? Because you said they're getting a lot of disinformation. And we were having this debate with the production team before the show started about, who is the source of information for young people? I mentioned Trevor Noah, and someone on the staff said, oh, no, he's too old. Young voters aren't listening to him. I was like, really? And then I mentioned the Breakfast Club. And they said 18-year-olds aren't watching the Breakfast Club. So tell me, where is your niece getting her voting or her information about politics from?
About politics. So she's receiving information from a mixed medium. So TikTok, of course, all these very fast mediums where they're really satirizing the news, right? They're making these jokes there. So she's getting it from these. And a lot of times the connotation to those, kind of gamified situations, they're receiving the most negative parts because that is the comedy. Those are the punch points. But then that translates into real disinformation for them, because if I'm making several jokes about the current president or about women's rights, I have a disassociation, or I have a misunderstanding of what's really important. But we love the Breakfast Club. We really like to see Charlamagne the God, like, he has this way of bringing in more current voices and showing, the breadth of diversity, right? He's bringing on characters that are speaking about a number of issues. And so people like us millennials are paying attention to the Breakfast Club. Some people are watching.
Who's 18? Now you're 30 or in your early 30s.
30.
So millennial, you watch Charlamagne the God, but is an 18-year-old? Is she watching the Breakfast Club?
I wouldn't think that as often that he's watching the Breakfast Club, but he's watching things like the Breakfast Club, or he's getting information
from the Breakfast Club. He may see that or see some version of it on TikTok.
Right. Yes.
So the Breakfast Club, Charlamagne the God, has this big audience. Is it mostly African American, or is it a diverse audience? Do you know?
I would say that it will be a diverse audience, from the people that he brings on to the extra shows that he appears on, because he's creating these offshoot shows that are drawing in on some of these very hard-hitting topics, and he's really
primarily is a radio show out of Washington D.C., but they do video of it, so it's on YouTube as well. And so he amassed this following, and now he's doing these offshoots. I think I was just recently on an offshoot show he has called What to Cook When You're Broke or something. One of those shows he has on the site. Yeah. I went on to cook something I used to make in law school, and I think that's a Charlamagne network. Yeah. Okay, so they're getting this disinformation, and we know on social media, if it's negative, if it's loud, that gets the most attention, right? So you have people making, fun of the president and a lot of our elected leaders, and those videos are going to get a lot of views because those are the kinds of things that get attention. How is your organization combating this disinformation?
So I'm here today representing Opportunity Youth United, which is a fuller movement that really addresses issues about 16 to 24-year-olds disconnected from work and opportunity. But I also work with the Center for Law and Social Policy on a new deal for youth, which is essentially a youth policy think tank where we're coming up with policies and suggestions to push through for legislation and administrative relief for younger people. So the way that we're combating this disinformation in both of these organizations is that we're pulling in young people with the lived experience, the individuals that are 18 to 30. We're supporting them in creating very relevant, culturally relevant and responsive content that they can display over these same mediums that young people may receive disinformation on, like a TikTok. So we have several social media arms that curates information graphics in these critical times. We also just held an event here, a forum here in Atlanta for mental health and wellness for young adults, where we painted a mural off of Martin Luther King Jr. Drive here, so 960 Martin Luther King Jr. So we're really integrating ourselves into the community to on foot combat this disinformation, bring people together. But then on the flip side, we're in DC, we're nationally pulling our efforts together, state to state, creating these policy suggestions, teaming up with people like CLASS, who help us through the process of, introducing our ideas to legislation.
What do you see as the biggest difference between voters who are in your age group, who are millennials, who we now, millennials are like 26 to 41 years old. So millennials be, parents, 2-3 kids. I mean, if you're 40 years old, you've seen a lot of life. You've voted in a lot of elections, hopefully. So how do you see millennial voters being different from Gen Z voters who are literally, that 18 to 26-year-old who may be like your niece who's going to vote in her first election?
We find it to be a little bit more critical because we're in our full adulthood at this time. We're working, we have families, we have careers and businesses. And so all of this stuff is full circle at this moment. And we're in our time. When we were in high school, we would have all said, I wish I was back in the day, when slavery was happening and all these other, injustices was happening, because I would have, been a real, go-getter or a rider.
I would have broke out. I would have freed all the slaves, right?
And so now we realize that this is our moment, right? So we're wrapping ourselves in our issue. We're really about our issue, and we're advocating for ourselves and our younger siblings, because they're some of the same ages as our children. It's really full circle, and we're in the homes intergenerationally taking care of our moms. So it is really full circle. We understand now at this time that not only is it important to vote in a presidential election, but then we have to wrap back around and vote locally. And now we know, even with that we have to wrap back around and go to our neighboring states and support them in voting locally, because this is about continuity. This is about strength in numbers, right? And being able to raise our voice at critical times.
Okay, so we've been talking about this Gen Z. My guest, next guest I want to bring into the conversation, her name is Stella Olson, and she is a Gen Z. She's a college student at the University of Minnesota. In high school, she founded an activist group to protest gun violence in her state and has remained very active in her college. Good morning and welcome, Stella.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So you heard Rosebud describe what he thinks the difference is between millennials and Gen Z. What do you think the biggest difference is between your generation and, say, someone like Rosebud, who's, maybe, I don't know, not even 10 years older than you?
I think there's a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of differences. In my generation, I'm noticing a lot of sadness and distaste for the government. We feel a large lack of representation. Like you said earlier, the age of who are representing us does not reflect their constituents. So there's this big gap between, our representatives being in their 60s, 70s, and the majority of constituents being in, their 20s to 50s. And there's policies that are not reflecting our opinions and our views and how we want our country to be run. Yet everything seems like it's moving backwards, which is so disheartening. And it's hard for us to then get up and feel the need to make a change. It's hard for us to feel motivated to vote. It's hard for us to feel motivated like we can do anything, because just recently we're seeing the Supreme Court overturn Roe v. Wade. That's not reflecting the majority of its constituents. That's not reflecting the majority of our country and our opinions and our views. So it's hard watching the country appear to be moving backwards.
Let me ask you this, Stella. You mentioned that the elected officials that are in office now don't reflect your age group. But when Bernie Sanders ran for president both times, he got a huge, a portion of his support came from your generation. And he is as old as Biden. So why was there a distinction between Bernie Sanders in his late 70s, white male, versus Joe Biden, who, similar ages?
I think Bernie is definitely the outlier of the situation. He's a radical socialist who, for my generation, is reflecting a lot of our views. And I've noticed, I can't speak for every Gen Z person, and I know I'm not, but there's a lot of us who are leaning more towards socialism, and Bernie reflected that for us, but he's the outlier. He's not the mold.
Do you feel like that your generation, and I'll ask Rosebud this too, had enough information provided in school about our government and the process? Because it looks like right now, a lot of the headlines are attacking Joe Biden. And more seasoned voters understand the separation of the Congress, the Senate, and the president, and they know the limitations of the president. So I'm just wondering, do you think schools do a good enough job of educating, students about those divisions and the limitations of each branch of our government?
No, I don't think so. For me, it was ninth grade when we learned civics and everything. And, you learn legislative, judicial, and congressional branch, but you don't, or executive branch, excuse me. See, I don't even, have them all in place. But you learn the basics, you learn each branch's role, but you don't, and there's checks and balances, but you don't go into depth really what they are. And come 10th grade, 11th grade, you've forgotten it all. I mean, there's not reinforcement of what our government is set up as. And really, that should be one of the most crucial things that we are taught in school. We should know how our government functions. We should know what actions we can take to have our voices reflected. But it's just not done to the extent that I feel like it should be.
I know we're having some technical differences with Rose, but I don't know. Let me know, Rashad, when we have him back. The other question, Stella, a lot of the headlines are attacking Joe Biden. And again, we talked about kind of our separation of power in this country. Many of the things that Joe Biden campaigned on, promised to do, as president, he doesn't make laws. He can use his bully pulpit to advocate for laws, but ultimately laws are made by the Congress, have to be passed by the Congress, then the Senate, then they make their way to the president's desk. Knowing that the Republicans in the House and the Senate have voted, have prevented many of the bills that Biden has tried to get passed, why don't we see more of the ire, the anger, the frustration of younger voters being directed at Republicans rather than at the president?
I think the polarization that Trump kind of created especially for my generation. I mean, that was the first election I voted in, was this last one. And then, all through high school was Trump's presidency. So that was kind of the peak of my activism and the peak of my anger. And I think we've reached a point where, at least for my generation, we almost don't even want to touch the Republican Party when it comes to discussing them, because we feel like there's not going to be any change. So if we can voice our opinions for our own party and our distaste for the decisions that our own party are making, it seems as though that will provide more change than expressing our anger towards the Republican Party and the decisions they're making, because of the polarization that Trump created between the Democrats and the Republicans.
That's interesting. Does your generation talk about how to get some of those Republicans out of office? Because if you're saying we're kind of taking this hands-off approach to them, the logical conclusion to that would be, well, let's get them out of office.
Right. Yeah, I think for my generation, it is a lot of getting people to vote. And again, people all have their own opinions about voting and the power it has. But the way our government is set up right now, voting is our main form of power. So we have to get out and vote. We have to go to these communities where there are incumbent Republican leaders who have been there for decades, who are just not doing what their constituents want. I think that's one thing that people forget, is that in simplicity, the government's job is to represent the constituents.
Right.
And that's lost throughout, everything. It's lost through every message. And people forget that voting is your main way of having your voice heard. And yeah, we just got to get out the vote and get the Republican leaders out that we don't feel are representing our views.
So, Rosebud, I was asking Stella about the education process, because I feel like people think that the president has more power than the president under our Constitution and democracy has. Do you think we are falling down on the job in terms of how we teach civics and the separation of power?
Yeah, I really do. And I agree with a lot of what Stella said as well. But I don't think that we receive education about it early enough or in completion. I think when we learn about the presidency in our younger years, it's too celebrated, right? Like, I think it's too, they turn him into this celebrity, and we learn so much about like military and their power of the military and courts. We really don't have a good understanding of how to differentiate between local election and our own courts and our own systems and policing. And so like, we don't learn about Georgia constitutions and stuff until we go into our first years of college. It's a mandated thing. And I think that's across the board, that everybody, when they first go, is required to learn about their state's constitution. But I think that should be something taught earlier on. And about local elections and how our hierarchy plays a role with the presidency and the courts.
And Rosebud, Stella said that, I was asking her, how come the ire and anger amongst young voters is directed towards the Democrats in office rather than the Republicans, who are obstructing the agenda of the Democratic president and who voted to overturn Roe v. Wade and who have refused to vote for gun safety laws. And she says she thinks that there is, no changing the Republicans, so let's work on our own party. What do you hear amongst millennials as to why we're not seeing that anger directed towards Republicans?
I think she was dead on with that. I think that some of the understanding is that Republicans are already who they are. But then it's more fundamental than that, too, that we never really understood what either party was actually about. And so now that we believed in the Democratic Party for so long, and they now run the White House, or they run most of the system, we're really looking for them to be as bullish as the Republicans were with their agendas and their objectives. And we're wondering, why is it now that we're not taking opportunity? And we're wondering if our party does care about the general well-being of the people. If this is your opportunity, they don't understand, the common person doesn't understand political strategy either. So once someone takes office, once local elections have to happen, we don't really see that process. We're wanting you to make these radical moves right now, right? And so we're just kind of disappointed but I think that he has been in office long enough, or Democrats have run things long enough, to where the people are just wondering, when are you going to expand the courts, cancel student debt? When are you going to protect women's rights, create federal protections? When are you going to create more economic mobility for these individuals? In the case that Biden does lose, when do you create a strategy that's left behind for us?
And those are good points. Let me unpack that a little. I want to ask both of you, are you guys familiar with the term that the Democratic Party is a big tent and what that term really means? Have you heard that, Stella?
Not really.
Okay. So I'm sure you have, Rosebud. So The Democratic Party is, like we often say about the African American community, the Asian community, or any ethnic community, it's not a monolithic party. The Democratic Party, when we say it's a Big Tent party, that means it welcomes everybody, all races, all ethnicities, ages, gender identities, and ideologies. So in the Democratic Party, you have very progressives, and you have a lot of super conservative and moderate Democrats, conservatives like Joe Manchin. I'm from Missouri. Claire McCaskill was my senator for years in Missouri. Claire McCaskill was a very moderate to conservative Democrat, because to win as a Democrat in states that have more Republican and independent voters, you can't be like Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, would not be the governor in Missouri with his ideologies around gay marriages and just his left thinking ways that he governs. So in those red states and southern states, the Democrats tend to be more conservative, and sometimes they look more like Republicans than they do Democrats. So, Rosebud, when you say, how come we don't have, a federal law around abortions, the reality is, even though we may have had control in theory of the Congress as Democrats, there are many Democratic candidates who are pro-life, who would not have voted for a federal codification of Roe v. Wade. So I think we have to be more nuanced when we talk about Democrats being in control. And I think you obviously are, learning this, Rosebud, as you are, out working in these various states. Joe Manchin wouldn't be governor or senator in California. But a lot of folks think, as obstructionist as he has been, that the alternative to a Joe Manchin in a West Virginia would cause us to lose a Democratic vote and maybe Ketanji Brown Jackson on something that we could get him to vote for, we would have lost. So I hope, Stella, in the organizing that you do, that you start to meet folks like Rosebud and Gen Z voters start to, be a little bit more critical in their thinking and their analysis of this, because the value of having the Big Ten is, you invite everybody. It's all inclusive. But Republican voters are a single issue. I want a Supreme Court that's going to overturn Roe v. Wade. I'm going to vote for the guy that's going to do that. I don't care what he does on climate, jobs, any other issue. And that's how Republicans traditionally have voted. We Democrats, guest last week said, we got to fall in love. Republicans fall in line. Democrats want to fall in love. Very different. So I think that's what's driving some of this lack of what you all may call radical lawmaking that you just identified, Rosebud. So in light of that, where do you think the party, how does the party reach Stella's generation, Rosebud? How do they get them to, fall in love with this Big Tent party?
How do we get them to fall in love with the Big Tent party? I really think that it's about connecting, educating young people really on the nuances of, what we can do locally with our representative versus what we can do at the federal level. I think confusion serves each party, right? Each politician, really. So when we don't understand the nuances between a conservative Democrat and a more liberal one, they all get to represent that title and get our votes. But I think that, politicians also have to be very brave in the fact that if you're doing a good job, regardless if you're conservative or liberal, that you can explain to young people exactly who you are, what you're standing for, and how to support the issue, the grander issue and solution. So, I don't know if that, any politician is wanting to move with that type of transparency. So, but I do think that type of transparency is what it takes to, really move a body of people that have been historically unmovable.
That's a great point. So Stella, what would it take, you think, for your generation to be more motivated. It breaks my heart to hear that, 60% of young people who are eligible to vote don't go to the polls. And even in that 2020 election, only half of young voters went to the polls. So we're losing, they call it, low propensity voters, that if we just picked up those voters, we wouldn't have, the math problem that we have in the Senate. We'd have a majority of like-minded Democrats, not, these obstructionist Democrats. So what do you think that message needs to be?
I think there needs to be more follow through. I think there's been a lack of proof of follow through with the promises that are made on the campaign trail. And, we gave Joe Biden a large chunk of time to follow through with his promises he made. And so far, we haven't seen much.
What promise specifically do you say he hasn't lived up to that he is capable of controlling?
And it's, obviously he can't write an executive order to eradicate student debt.
No.
But he's doing nothing. I mean, at least from my point of view, I haven't seen any steps. I haven't seen any discussion about it. Obviously, it's not a cut and dry, simple solution. But there's not much we're seeing from his seat in office and those under him.
Do you agree with that, Rosebud, that the president and administration has not talked about or made any efforts to address the student loan debt crisis? We keep having some technical issues with him. Okay, so what else do you think he hasn't lived up to in terms of promises?
I just think there's been a lot of silence.
I lost for a second.
Yeah.
I apologize. I lost you, not to cut you off, Stella. I wouldn't say that I wholly agree with that. He hasn't spoke about it. We have individuals in my group that are really moving to cancel student debt, like my friend Wisdom Cole, who is the national director of NAACP Youth Division. He's been really calling for 50,000 plus, cancellation of student debt. Biden has been offering like 10,000. There has been negotiation, there's conversation, but nothing that really moves a needle for the people that need it the most. If we were to get that cancellation of student debt, that would mean economic mobility for millennials and anybody behind us, right? Our younger ones, like the Gen Zs and the other individuals. We're able to create wealth and legacy out of that money. And so even if they were to cancel the 10,000, we're going to still ask for more. That's only a beginning. And so like Biden can write certain executive orders. Some things will be washed out if another administration comes in, but it's the relief that we need right now. But those things too have to be balanced out by strategy. And we may not have a vision of what the full strategy is for the White House right now.
Do you all give the administration credit for things like Biden being the first president ever to select an African-American female as vice president, the first president ever to appoint an African-American woman to the Supreme Court, to appoint more African-American judges to the federal appellate bench, create more jobs in his first 2 terms than ever? You said that he gets no credit for that, Rosebud?
No, Obama gets all the credit for that.
Obama gets a credit for
How
does Obama get credit for
right, I'm going to take it back 2 administrations. Because with the historic step of Obama, we had a vision of a Black person in that seat. With the buffoonery of Trump, we looked back at somebody like Obama and we elected a Joe Biden because he stood with Obama in those historic times. With his position ahead of Trump, he decided to pick the first Black woman. And that was great. That's something that we celebrate. And even as we push, he picked a first Black woman as Supreme Court justice. These are things that were prepped for him to do. And if he didn't do it, I think he would be remiss and we would feel disrespected because
come on, Rosebud, you have to get was there. Oh, come on, Rosebud, you're a mature voter. Now, Joe Biden, a white man, did not lose his white privilege in this world. He didn't have to Kamala Harris. Now, you know that. Now, come on, you and I can keep it 100. Now,
I agree.
I like Kamala Harris. we'd have been mad, but we fall in line as Black voters. We'd have fell in line. So even without her, we would have been at the polls, maybe not in the same numbers, but we
polls, right.
So you know how we do.
Yes.
Let me ask you this, Stella, because I got to let you guys go. Everybody is, your generation says no to Biden. Who do you all want to be the president?
I could not tell you right now because there isn't anyone that I wholeheartedly want to put my name behind and, support at this moment. But I'm hopeful that people will come out on the scene and that we'll have better options come these midterms. I'm just crossing my fingers, crossing my toes, really hoping that we have someone come in time for the midterms to properly represent us.
Okay, Rosebud, I don't know if you've heard Joe Biden say he's running again and he's tired of us saying he's not, but let's assume he decides not to. Do you have a favorite you'd like to see run on the Democratic ticket for president?
No, I don't have a favorite that I would like to see run. I actually like that, if we get a president that we can, work with in the White House, that we should support him in another term because of continuity. Not enough can be done in a 2-year or 4-year term. And so I just think it benefits us to work with Biden as the Democrats hold, everything right now. And just let's give him another term.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. I hope, Stella, that you continue to encourage voters in your community to get out and vote. And one of the things that I think Rosebud and his generation has come to realize is that, politics is not for the faint of heart. And it's like running a marathon. It's not a sprint. And he's just said it. 2 years is like 2 seconds in terms of elected office, in terms of what you can get done. And we appreciate your voice. I think the voices of young voters like yours are really, really important because you all are going to keep pushing on those issues. And even if you don't get $50,000 in debt relief, maybe you get $30,000 because of you guys raising your voices. Just like we just saw that bipartisan gun bill. It wasn't what we all wanted. We wanted to ban those assault weapons, right? We wanted to raise the age. We didn't get any of that, but we got the first bipartisan bill in 30 years passed. And over time, as you mature as a voter, you'll start to recognize those are wins. They're not big radical wins, but they are wins. And again, thank you so much for doing the work that you're doing and keep encouraging those voters. And Rosebud, we are counting on you all in Georgia. Okay, if Herschel Walker is elected as the senator in Georgia, I'm coming for you because I'm putting that in your hands to make sure that those voters in Georgia go to the polls. That would be the biggest.
Yes, we're teaming up with New Georgia Project, so
oh my God,
I'm really focused on those 2 elections, and then our neighboring states. OYU has, they have several young people that they've granted get out the vote funds to, and so we'll be supporting our neighboring cities as well as getting some of these historic elections done.
Absolutely. If we can get Warnock back in office, if we can pick up Pennsylvania, if we pick up Ohio, North Carolina, we have a real shot at transforming this country. We've got to just stay focused on those numbers. But okay, Georgia, we count on you again. Georgia keeps being in the hot seat.
Yes. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Rose. Thanks, Stella. All right, my next guest is Dr. Jen Domingo Goodman. She is Executive Director, All In Campus Democracy Challenge. And this is a group working as a part of Civic Nation. Good morning and welcome. Oh, Dr. Domingo Goodman. So you heard these young voters, one a millennial, one a Gen Z, talk about why they are motivated and why they aren't motivated. What are you seeing in the work that you are doing? Because I know you're working on college campuses across this country. What is your data telling you?
Sure. First of all, thanks, Areva, for having me. Please definitely call me Jen. And it was so great to hear Rosebud and Stella talking about the important and incredible work that each of them are doing in their own kind of spheres of influence. I lead the All-in-Campus Democracy Challenge, a national nonpartisan initiative of Civic Nation. We work with more than 900 colleges and universities across all 50 states plus DC to help improve what we call democratic engagement. So civic learning, political engagement, and voter participation, and are really excited to be doing that and to really think about how we close gaps in age and race and help build an electorate that's more representative of our country. And, as part of that, college students certainly aren't a monolith, just like neither of these generations that we've been talking about are. And we have, students of all different ages and races and areas of study that we are trying to reach. And so, I think we're seeing some of the same issues that, we're talking about here. I think we're seeing, we are nonpartisan, but I think we're seeing growing numbers of young people who don't identify with a particular political party, which is all well and good, but some of them don't understand a lot of the structural pieces of our democracy. And so you talked about a little bit of that with the previous two guests, but some of that is, to vote in primary elections. Sometimes if you don't have a political party that you've established, you may not be able to vote in that. I'm actually wearing my sticker today. I'm a Maryland resident and went and voted earlier this morning in the Maryland state primaries.
Watching two of those races, the congressional race with Donna Edwards and Glenn Ivey, and then that gubernatorial race with Wes Moore. So
exactly. So really important races. And, and I think you heard them talk about how important, local, and you've talked about how important local elections are. I think, a piece of that is really helping folks understand and goes back to that education. And so, as we're working with college students and frankly with the communities that they're part of, a piece of that is building on the fact that many of them aren't getting that education at the K-12 level. And so we have a responsibility, each of us, as students, as organizers, as folks working with institutions, we need to be a village that's helping grow voters. And so, there's issues of enthusiasm and interest and disappointment. There are also structural issues and barriers that young people are facing and that they face in larger numbers than other voters, right? So becoming a first-time voter is in itself, a set of things. You may have to have the right ID. They tend to move more. They may not have the ID that matches that address. They may miss deadlines that they didn't even know about because it changes from state to state or locality to another locality. And so there are all of these pieces. We also know there are things we can be doing that would make that easier, right? So same day voter registration or online voter registration, allowing for early voting, not requiring, strict IDs, allowing student IDs to count, for instance. And there have been bills in front of Congress that have, been proposed and failed. There's another one that Nikema Williams, and a representative in Georgia, and Senator Warren of Massachusetts recently introduced, the Youth Voting Rights Act that we've been endorsing. It would allow pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds universally. It would allow student IDs to count as voter IDs. It would require public institutions serve as polling places. Many of them want to and haven't been able to. Part of the goal is, what are the things we can be doing that makes this easier? How do we make sure that we are introducing young people to the process and the structures around it as early as possible, in addition to then changing it, right? I have a 9-year-old. I want this to look very different when she's ready to vote. We shouldn't need to require registration, which should be able to be automatic. There are lots of things we could do that would make this easier. But if we're not unifying around some of those things, and if we're not making sure that we're educating, then we're missing the boat. And some of the folks who aren't even registered won't be able to make that choice about whether they want to show up at the polls or not.
Are most college students voting? Are they voting in their state of residence? So if I live in New York and I go to college in North Carolina, what election am I voting in?
They have the right to vote in either place, and usually they're voting where they view their community, just like, other retired persons who may spend time in multiple states. Most of them are voting in the state that they're from. Most of them are going to school fairly close apart. It's kind of a smaller population that goes to school out of state. But we need to help them make those choices. We need to help them understand that they have implications. They may need to, apply for an absentee ballot, even if they're going to school in state. They may need to change their address and update their registration. There may be different dates and deadlines and processes than they were used to in a previous state. and so I think a piece of that is making sure we're having, those educational moments. And we know that, if you're able to have a conversation with a young person about, their ability to register, then they're more likely to, and then they can make the choice about whether they're actually going to exercise that right. But if we're not even getting them all registered, we're already missing a huge proportion. And some of the recent data has shown that, we don't have as many of the first time 18-year-olds registered right now than we did in 2018. And so we have our work cut out for us. It's, I don't mean to be doom and gloom. I think we need to have hope, but we need to do the work to make that happen.
What is being done by your organization? I actually went to your conference, the Civic Nation conference that was here in Los Angeles recently. And I know they had organizers from all over the country, a lot of youth organizers on panels. What is being done to combat the disinformation? We were just having that conversation with Rosebud and Stella. And a lot of Gen Z voters, like Stella said, she never heard the concept that the Democratic Party is a big tent party. And she's a college student, well-educated, but, the issues around politics and information around politics is not being taught. She said, schools did a pretty poor job of it. And so you get the lack of education, then you get the miseducation. How are we combating that? Like even just educating people about facts and then combating the disinformation?
You're asking a really key question. And I think we ask it a lot of young people, but I think we're seeing older adults and others, face that just as much these days in terms of how, the kind of internet age has changed, what we consider trusted information, where we get our information, how we do that. I think one of the things I often say is, growing up, you often heard this adage of like, don't talk religion and politics at the dinner table. And I would say the opposite. You have to talk, especially politics, at the dinner table. And that dinner table, I say, is a metaphor, right? It's like with your friends and your colleagues and your neighbors and in your classes. And I think, college is a great place to be able to do that. There's, spaces in classrooms where, faculty aren't as worried about being kind of shut down by, politicians and parents and things like that. Although it's not unheard of, I think there need to be pieces of that where you're finding that information. I think we need to be sharing pieces. When I researched my ballot for today, I went to vote411.org, right? And took a look to see, who was on my ballot and could then go to their bios and kind of look at that. But I also looked at news pieces. And I think part of it is, how are we teaching that? How are we engaging in those conversations? How are we making sure that institutions that may be trusted by young people, whether that is their peer groups, whether it's organizations like Rosebuds, whether it's their college or university, are sharing nonpartisan information, are sharing the information about where to find the information.
Well, let me just stop you there, Jen. Yeah. You, I know, are part of a nonpartisan group, but there are not very many nonpartisan people left in this country. So when you say sharing nonpartisan information, the reality is, as Stella said, the country is so divided that it is unlikely that any young person is getting information that is clearly nonpartisan. They're likely to be solicited and targeted online by either those that are pushing a very conservative message or those that are pushing a very, either progressive or democratic or liberal message, however you want to characterize it. So I don't know how a young person that, lives in this world today is not being bombarded with these partisan messages.
I think you raise a really good point. I think it's twofold. I think they are getting more partisan messages in some of those online spaces. They're also actually hearing less than other folks from candidates themselves. And part of it's because they're, until they voted for the first time, their names and phone numbers aren't on those voting records that can be pulled and targeted. And so it's kind of, unfortunately, both. They may be getting some very specific ads but other pieces. I think one of the things we're doing is when we work with these campuses, we're asking them to establish nonpartisan voting coalitions on campus that involve different stakeholders, including local election officials, including obviously students, including groups that are doing nonpartisan work on the ground. We're asking them to create data-informed action plans that include elements of how they're going to register, educate, and turn students out to vote. And a lot of that is having candidate forums. It's having study sessions where folks can work on figuring out how they find information to use for their ballot. So not telling them how to, but telling them where they can find information that is reliable, how to find out, what endorsements mean, how to find out where to find even who's going to be on their ballot, so they're not then surprised when they show up and they know they want to vote for governor or president or, city council, but all of a sudden they realize they have to vote for all of these judges and all of, the sheriff and, state's attorney and these other offices that some of them have never even heard of, and so I think being able to have those moments and being able to make that part of our educational practice is really important. But it also can't just be colleges and universities who are doing that work, or we're missing a whole segment of our young people.
Yeah, one of the things that came out in that New York Times poll is that 50% of young voters think their vote doesn't matter. How do we combat that? Or like Stella said, and she didn't say it as forcefully as others, but some folks who say, the president has done nothing. So they get these very extreme kind of messages and they become talking points and they internalize them. How do you combat that?
I think, if the question is how do we combat, thinking your vote doesn't count, I think we have to tell the stories about where it does count and why it counts, right? I think we have to talk about the number of elections that have been down to a handful of votes. I think we need to talk about the fact that often they're seeing that when they're looking at the headline kind of executive office, that looks like it's determined. But if they care about different issues, whether it's Black Lives Matter or gun violence or abortion, reform rights, or, whatever the issues, that climate change, whatever the issues a young person cares about, that there are so many other offices that matter that are going to come down to handfuls of votes, right? And so I think it's that piece. It's understanding kind of that efficacy, and it's also understanding that we don't fix everything at the ballot box. And so, what other ways, are we agitating for changes?
Have you done any research, or do you know if there's any research out there that, because one of the things I'm finding, and we saw it with Stella, the difference between a Stella voter at 21 and a Rosebud at 31, huge difference in terms of just, like all of us in college, we want to conquer the world. We want to, solve all the problems. We think we can do it. And then as you mature, as Rosebud talked about, become a millennial, you go into the workforce, you get a job, you have a business, you have kids, you just start to mature, and your voting starts to mature with that. Your recognition, as you just said, that voting or electoral politics, not voting, but electoral politics won't solve all the woes of our country, of our communities. Is there any studies that show when that kind of mindset starts to set in for voters? Is it at 25? Is it at 30? Is it at 35? Because I think a part of what's happening, that we're seeing this backlash right now, is because there is amongst young people this notion that everything that they wanted should have been done and should be done now, versus more mature voters who say, oh my God, given all the obstacles, a lot has already been done. And we know if we had more time and more numbers, more could get done. So when does that mindset start to shift, if you know?
I don't think you can pinpoint it at a specific point in time. I think we know a few things. And I will also just say, I hope that tension always stays. I think that's part of a tension we need, right? We need folks who are like, we need to change this now, because there are a lot of things that we really would be doing better if we changed, right? And we need folks who understand change doesn't always happen right now, that, justice is a long arc, that there are lots of small wins that we need to celebrate on the way to, other pieces. And, I hope
you're not aware of any studies that have looked at that. Like,
I think the studies, like what you see is that, once you've voted for the first time, you're more likely to vote again. And if you miss an election, it's usually because of some certain circumstances. You missed a deadline, you moved too recently, whatever. I also think, studies seem to indicate that once you really start to feel part of a community, you are, and you're putting down those roots, whatever that looks like, whether it means, a long-term place you're renting, whether it means you've finally decided, this city or the state is your home, whether it means, whatever, that you start putting some of those roots down, that then you're starting to get engaged beyond just thinking about, that one election. And that, those are generalities. But I think, it's that hurdle.
Study out there that showed, that the majority of voters at age 30 or at age 35 have a different view of the electoral process. And I like what you said about that tension, because I do think that tension is really important as well. I guess what I worry about is the dissatisfaction that younger voters say they have. If you're dissatisfied and you still vote, that's great. But if that dissatisfaction turns into, my vote doesn't matter, I'm not going to vote, that's the problem. Not the attacks on the institution, not the attacks on the elected officials, not the pushing. Oh, that's great. That's how change happens.
Yeah.
Right? We need that. But some of these polls suggest that these voters are dissatisfied to the point where they're going to sit it out. That's the biggest worry I have.
I'm there with you. I think, regardless of party, regardless of position, we want to see young people and all people, feel like it matters and stay engaged and pay attention. I think, part of that's on all of us, right, to have the conversations, to make the change. I think part of it is, a colleague recently said something about, hope is a practice. It's not just something you have to practice having hope. It's kind of a muscle you build, same way you might do yoga or, whatever sport, you have to keep practicing it. And it was one of the, because there have been moments, I would say any of us have not felt very hopeful about things recently. And I think, I lean into that. And I think we have to talk about that. And we have to talk about the fact that, things don't always go the way we want. Things aren't always bright and rosy the way we're kind of taught sometimes in, the limited civic education we get in K-12.
I like what Rose was, that we study our presidents as celebrities. So
I really, when he said that, you learn, what are we learning?
That's what we're doing, like, revering Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. Before I let you go, I do want to ask, I know you're nonpartisan, and I presume, well, based on what they said, Rosebud and Stella are both Democratic voters. Have you done any work with young conservative voters? Because I'm wondering, we've seen a lot of established Republican lawmakers who are parroting Donald Trump's big lie about the election being rigged, and not that he won the election, that Joe Biden didn't win. Joe Biden is not a legitimate president. So we've seen some adult Republican elected officials parrot that. We've seen some remain quiet in the face of that. But do you know, has there been any studies about young conservative voters, millennials and Gen Z conservatives? Where are they? Are they, for the most part, buying into the system was rigged, there was voter fraud, Donald Trump really won? Or are they like Mike Pence, who has said, no, the election was legitimate, Joe Biden won?
Areva, I'll emphasize, the work that Allen's doing is to help, support all students regardless of their, their political affiliation and beliefs, that we want them all to become more active and informed citizens, and to help, democratic culture be a defining moment on campus. That said, there are students who identify as Democrats and Republicans and Green Party and a whole lot of others that are part of the voting coalitions on campus and are having, their voices be a piece of that work. And I think the thing I would emphasize is young voters are as diverse, if not more diverse, than the general voting population.
If you work with any conservative young voters, what are you hearing from them?
Yeah. And I think, there are large numbers of them that don't kind of pull the party line, with their party and don't believe that happened, or are more socially liberal. And I think there are others, who don't. And I think the same can be said for, the young Democrats and others on campus, that, that they hold different and diverse viewpoints and are, I hope, being challenged to really think about what they believe and what they want to see in our country now and in the future.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jen, for the work that you're doing, that Civic Nation is doing. I know this is the organization, right, that Michelle Obama was very instrumental in starting and has remained active in. I actually saw her at the convention they had here in Los Angeles. A lot of folks coming out of the Obama administration are part of it. And the, I guess, national president now is a young African-American woman that worked in the Obama administration. So we're getting lots of young folks involved in our national politics. So again, thanks for the work that you're doing and good luck in, these upcoming elections.
Thank you so much.
Our eye on what happens in Maryland for sure. I want to thank all of my guests today. I always love to hear what young folks are thinking because, if we know what they're thinking, then we can address some of the issues they have head on. And we know, I think the biggest thing that came out of this conversation for me is that we have a information and education gap that so many of our young voters, as Jen said, even older voters, don't quite understand the checks and balances, our three branches of government, the power and the limitations of the president, the importance of electing both senators and congresspeople and local electors. I think Rosebud put it well when we talked about these local elections, particularly now with Roe v. Wade being overturned. It's going to be state legislators who are making decisions about whether you can have an abortion or not in your state. It's not going to be the president. So if you're mad about, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, don't direct your ire at Joe Biden. He has very limited power to change that. But your state legislators, those people that you send to your state, legislative body, they are making those decisions. Those, Indiana legislators, those Texas legislators, those Georgia legislators who are saying in some cases that women who are at risk for dying, that 10-year-old girls who get raped, that, even in those cases, they are going to be forced to carry to term a baby. So we got to do better. Got to do better with our information and our education because we know education is power. Just some words to live by before I get out. Bad governments are elected by good people who don't vote. Say that again. Bad governments are elected by good people who don't vote. So no matter what your feelings are, or if you are in your feelings about the Democrats, don't let your feelings stop you from voting. Think about all those people that died, all those people that risked their lives so that we could have the right to vote in this country. Honor them by voting. And voting is how you change things. It may not be overnight, may not be radical change, but change does come when we all vote. Be safe out there and remember we're all in this together.